I appreciate it. It seems like we keep adding slashes to the end of my name here, so that's actually really good. I really appreciate the opportunity to work. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us here today. We're going to provide an inside view of the inaugural report from the California Probation Resources Institute, otherwise known as CAPRI. As was already stated, my name is John Keene. I'm the Chief Probation Officer of San Mateo County. The purpose of CAPRI is to fill the void we have seen on the national level about probation research that is specific to California. This California-specific research will help us to further our use of evidence-based approaches in probation, to help us better understand and implement policies that help keep our communities safe and help rehabilitate our clients. I'm excited to share with such an esteemed group of professionals this report that analyzes the impact of Senate Bill 678. Which provided an incentive-based funding to county probation departments. SB 678 passed in 2009 as an investment in probation to implement evidence-based supervision to significantly reduce caseloads to allow probation officers more quality individual attention to each adult client. This was a game changer for probation. Not only did it mark a turning point for probation's work with adults, it also gave a roadmap for state and local partnerships to keep communities safe with a focus on effective rehabilitation. Since 678, probation has experienced a significant culture shift with a renewed focus on individualized approaches and determining through evidence-based practices the appropriate programs, services, and supervision needed for client success. This is a shift away from an over-reliance on incarceration, which has really been a big catalyst for how California sees community safety. We can use our knowledge and results from the past decade and apply it across our entire justice system as we move forward. Senate Bill 678 represents an important partnership between state and locals to achieve better public safety outcomes, save tax dollars, and give people the tools they need to turn their lives around. The presentation today will provide an overview of that research that took a very deep dive into the impacts of Senate Bill 678, and this report is a reflection of my personal experiences with probation over the last 22 years. The researchers commissioned to conduct this research are respected experts in this area of policy. I'm very pleased today to introduce Mia Bird, who's a visiting professor, associate professor at UC Berkeley, and Riken Gute, who is a professor of sociology at UC Davis. So without further ado, professors, would you like to take over?
Thank you, Chief. That was a great introduction. We are excited to talk with you all today. We're going to walk through some slides that just briefly outline what we found in this report, and then open it up to, I believe Karen's going to walk us through some questions and open it up to questions after that. So Riken is going to man the slide, so we can go ahead and get started, Riken. All right, so just to reiterate much of what the Chief said, SB 678 really did fundamentally transform our probation system in California. And there were a few ways it did this. I think the first and probably the most important was that it addressed persistent funding gaps that we were experiencing in the state. Equally important though, it aligned the state and county interests toward common goals. And really, when we look back on SB 678, it's clear that it propelled California to the forefront of what was becoming a national movement toward evidence-based practice. So it really helped California to stand out at the forefront of that movement and really set the stage for the decade of reforms that would follow, including realignment and Prop 47 and a number of other reforms. And so what we did was we dug in a little bit to the policy history. This was really fascinating for us. We got to learn a lot about what had come before SB 678. And something that was actually quite similar was the Probation Subsidy Act of 1965. Some of you may be familiar with it. We weren't when we got started on this research. But what we learned is it was quite similar in the sense that it was an incentive-based funding program that really stabilized probation support from the state for a period from about 1965 to 1978 when it ended. And in the period that followed, probation funding became less stable. And by 2009, when SB 678 was passed, it was really just a patchwork of grants that supported the adult probation system. And what we learned is that really California stood out relative to other states in this way. Most states primarily funded their probation systems at the state level, and California was quite different. And so at the time that SB 678 was passed, you know, a lot of you probably recall there was concern at the state level about the size of the prison population and the costs of incarcerating that population, the crowding of the prison system. So those were really concerns that underlie the passage of SB 678. But there was also a lot of movement and the emergence of evidence on the potential to really efficiently use evidence-based interventions to reduce incarceration and reduce the need for incarceration. And so these two things combined together really created the perfect environment for the development of something like SB 678. So the legislative change really did five things. It provided that stable source of funding that California needed for the probation system, for the adult probation system. It established performance goals that align state and county interest. It encouraged collaboration both within counties at the county level across agencies and also between the counties and the state to achieve those goals. And it really emphasized evidence-based practice and focused resources on evidence-based interventions, but followed that with monitoring of outcomes and rewarding of success. And that turned out to be sort of the perfect package that SB 678 provided. What we found, and we focused largely on the 2 years that followed SB 678, because as we know, beginning in 2011, we had the introduction of realignment and then many other changes that complicate the picture. And we're happy to discuss this as we go. But in those 2 years that followed, in that first year, we saw this dramatic reduction, a 23% reduction in prison revocations. So a really surprising achievement of one of the key goals under SB 678 right away. And that meant about 6,000 fewer people were admitted to prison during that year, and the state saved an estimated $179 million. And a large share of that, $87.5 million, was then transferred to the county probation systems to support the continued use of evidence-based practice. And so all of that taken together really tells us that there was a big shift after SB 678 toward the goals and outcomes of the legislation. And so, of course, there were questions, there were concerns. You know, this is effectively reducing the population in prison and keeping more people in the community under probation supervision. So one of the key questions is what would happen with respect to public safety? And what we saw following SB 678 is that crime rates went down, both violent and property crime. And in the years that followed under realignment and other reforms, we do see fluctuation in crime rates. But when we look at the whole past decade, what we see is no change in violent crime rates, a slight reduction, and actually quite a large reduction in property crime rates. So in terms of public safety outcomes, we saw that we could effectively reduce the prison population, keep more people under supervision, and also maintain public safety under SB 678. So I'm going to turn it over to Riken now. He's going to discuss the sort of the culture shift that also occurred in the use of evidence-based practice.
Thanks, Mia. Mia was really kind of summarizing some of the context and background and the sort of impacts of 678. I'm going to focus a little bit more on how probation work kind of has changed during this period. And we can rely on, in the report, we rely on a number of different data sources that we kind of put together to tell the story. One really useful resource in this is the Judicial Council's annual assessment of SB 678. But we also, in the planning of the research, realized that we needed to have a kind of closer look at what was going on right now in probation. And so with sort of CPOC sort of helping us design and field a study of current probation practices in late 2019, we were able to kind of get a very unique view. And many of the questions that we were able to ask were, in a sense, sort of modeled after previous surveys undertaken by the Board of State and Community Corrections. So we're able to kind of use that to construct kind of a trend in how probation work is. Let me just give some of the highlights of what we found. Um, Based on kind of what the Judicial Council's reports reveal, there was a fairly rapid uptick in the first few years after SB 678 in the embracing of evidence-based practices. And just as one example, currently about 80% of agencies and probation agencies in the state rely on risk and needs assessment, which is in many ways sort of the cornerstone of evidence-based practices. But other kinds of evidence-based practices have also increased in terms of being put in the field across the state. We also asked some questions again that allowed us to track some changes over time in probation work. And when researchers have studied probation in the past, they tend to sort of characterize the nature of probation work as consisting of kind of enforcement duties and enforcement tasks and more social work kinds of tasks. So the questions that we use here are meant to kind of characterize shifts, and what we see in looking at these surveys across many different types of questions, a kind of consistent pattern of expansion of the social work aspects of the job. A greater number of probation officers and supervisors report using services, referring people to professional evaluation, construction of case plans. All of those things are associated with the social work aspect of the job, and at the same time, we see a fairly consistent, stable level of a rating of the frequency of various enforcement tasks, along with the value and importance of those tasks. And again, I won't take you through all of the weeds of the specific question, but the story that emerges here is really quite clear. And this is another table that sort of shows that. But we also wanted to ask some questions about current probation practice. And again, given that risk and needs assessments are sort of the cornerstone of evidence-based practices, we wanted to try and gauge how frequently those risks and needs assessments are being conducted, and how frequently they drive how an individual is supervised. And you can see from this that quite high levels of our respondents reported that they are using the risk score to determine supervision, and that a majority are using at a very high frequency the assessment to determine where to direct probationers, people under supervision. So again, kind of just a testament to what we learned from the Judicial Council study, that risk and needs have been quite widely adopted throughout the state. We also asked, we wanted to know whether or not even if there's an embracing of evidence-based practices, that could be limited by the opportunities to find services in the community that people can be referred to. And in general, we found that there was a high level of sort of satisfaction with the service capacity in communities for these various types of interventions, but with a couple of exceptions. And so there seems to be a kind of general consensus that for a lot of folks, that there was not sufficient capacity for programs for the severely mentally ill or sex offenders. And so those represent kind of areas that, continued effort is really needed. We also asked questions about, an organization can implement evidence-based practices. There can be programs out there ready and waiting, but we want to know whether or not the sort of rank and file of probation officers and supervisors really have embraced those practices. And again, we see in this data a very high level of embracing principles of evidence-based practice, which goes probably most closely to this idea of kind of a changing culture in probation, where evidence-based practices has been elevated, service, case planning, risk needs assessment, all of those things have elevated in importance and the frequency with which they're being performed. In general, the story here is quite a positive one, really, in terms of what the aftermath of 678 has been. It expanded and stabilized funding for probation departments around the state. It allowed for the reduction of caseloads. It increased the capacity for supervision, and it helped probation departments really move forward in their pursuit of evidence-based, sort of state-of-the-art forms of supervision, and then also sort of a kind of a better alignment emerges in this 678 period in terms of what the state's objectives are and what the local partners to the state are. And then finally, part of the reason why these changes have been undertaken, 678 as well as all of the subsequent one, is to reduce incarceration, save money, and this was certainly an important step in achieving both of those goals. So just kind of looking ahead, really, the key concern is that the funding that has been so useful is stable and continues into the future, and that those departments and agencies that are still lagging behind somewhat can continue to make progress. There may be some need for more targeted sorts of support for those agencies that have made less progress than the vast majority. And then, of course, one of the important companions to the evidence-based practices movement is the development of systems for tracking data, using it for management and research purposes in order to engage in sort of continuous improvement. And this is an area where there continues to be a need for additional support. And so one of our conclusions in the report is to focus on that and these other issues. So I think that's it. With that, I'll kind of kick it back over to Karen, and you can help us moderate the Q&A.
Great, thank you so much. And so just to remind folks, if you go onto the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, you'll have to probably move your mouse over to that area to have it pop up. You can enter a question and I will be happy to ask it. So to start, I want to remind folks that the report is also available in a couple of places, but on our website, www.cpoc.org. So you can find all of this information there as follow-up. And our first question is, if you could address, you mentioned cost savings in your report. Were you able to identify the drivers of those cost savings? How did the cost savings happen?
Sure. I think the clear driver was a reduction in prison revocations, which meant fewer people were being returned to prison, were being admitted to prison, and were imposing costs, the high cost of prison incarceration at the state level. And we know that probation supervision is much less costly than prison incarceration. And so by keeping more people in the community, by managing their needs and their risks through probation supervision, we were able to save money for the state.
Great, thank you. And can you talk a little bit, you mentioned the word success and that you found that there were successes in the program. Can you talk a little bit more specifically of how you define success or what you thought was most successful in the program?
Hopefully I won't start coughing. Yeah, so, you know, if the goal of SB 678 was, well, it had many different goals described, but in terms of, you know, sort of changing the nature of work by providing it with greater resources, by having it increase its focus on evidence-based practices as sort of a guiding principles. All of the work that we all of the data that we report in the study sort of, you know, is pretty good documentary evidence of success. But let's be clear on what this is not. It's not individual agency by agency level assessment or targeting specific programs. That kind of research work is essential, but the focus here was really on sort of the policy impacts and how probation has been changing over the last decade at a fairly high level.
Great, thank you. Any thoughts on specifically when you did do the research on the officers, kind of how they did their work, the practice, the change in attitude, what may have led to that? Did your research show anything specific to that?
That's a great question, and you know, sort of one of the limits of a survey data is that it allows us to chart change without really being able to get at why the change took place. But I think even more concerning is the flip side of that question. Why are some agencies, why are some individual officers sort of less inclined towards embracing kind of the newer practices in probation work? And neither of those questions can be answered definitively in research like this. We have spoken to probation chiefs. One of the hypotheses is that there's an old guard that is new innovations that you know, and so maybe there's a dimension of recalcitrancy from people who have, you know, it's not the probation that they started working in 20 years ago or something.
Karen, I'll just add, you know, one of the things that we learned in this research was how high probation caseloads were at the time the SB 678 passed, really more than double and sometimes 3 times the evidence-based level. And so in talking with former chiefs over this period and current chiefs, one of the things that became clear is that reducing caseloads was the first step, because what that did was it made it possible for people, first of all, to hire new folks. Having funding and hiring new folks and reducing caseloads made it possible to really transition the culture by bringing in new folks, and also made it possible for people who had their caseloads reduced to actually engage in some training around evidence-based practices, both why we believe that they work and what you need to do specifically for individuals with different risk and needs types. And then also to have the time to help connect people, to do more case management and connecting people to those programs and services. And so from the evidence-based literature, we know that caseloads can't be too high. If they are too high, there's no way to make a functional system where you invest in interventions that prevent further justice involvement.
Great, thank you. Scrolling through here, it looks like we have, oh yes, Chief King, do you have could add to that question probably, or the answer to that?
You know, I just want to add a little bit to it because I think that both Riken and Mia's comments are spot on. I think it's a real true combination of both. Having been a probation officer initially before 678 and seeing the benefits of it after the fact, I think it was a matter of many of us who had been kind of indoctrinated into the quote unquote probation way, and it looked very different after 678. And this idea of providing services became a real reality for us. Before, we talked a lot about services, but couldn't actually provide those services because the resources weren't there. So it was difficult to convince probation officers at the time that this was I think, a bona fide practice and an opportunity to really make a difference when there were no opportunities to make real actual referrals. But I think what we saw over time was, as the caseload numbers reduced, because I think that was a significant factor, speaking as a person who certainly had caseloads over 200 in my career, seeing those numbers come down to a more manageable amount, then combine that with opportunity to provide direct services to those clients really made a benefit and had a huge impression on our ability to accept that evidence-based practices would be not only legitimate, but actually could have lasting impacts. And it didn't hurt, I should say, that as we started to get younger, younger probation officers were certainly more adept at new ways of thinking and doing opportunities. But I can tell you, for me, the fact that I can now not only start providing services, for example, by doing evidence-based group practices around cog therapy and things of that nature, but also I can make referrals to programs that also provided services. The combination of those two things were really true game changers, and they really helped facilitate change in, I think, culture and mindset more than anything else.
Great, thank you. You talked a little bit about your conclusions, and the findings, but now that we're in the Q&A portion, can you talk a little bit about what you see as either things we can do in the future with this information? Any suggestions?
Well, I think for Riken and I, we really see sort of the next frontier as one in which probation departments are empowered both to draw on the literature, so they have access to and understand how to effectively draw on the evidence-based literature in order to target programming and other interventions, but also empowered to monitor and evaluate what they're doing on the ground. And so that's what we hope to really support counties in doing over time. What that gives you is the ability to understand the effects of a program for your population and to really look at who is most benefited by a particular intervention. And then it allows you to also make that cost comparison, which I think if budgets are more constrained in the future, which they always are at some point, that focus on cost effectiveness is going to be even more important. And so really being able to look at your population, the interventions they received, and the outcomes that they achieved, to understand how things are working on the ground, and then to be able to think about where to target limited resources to get the most impact. I think that's what we see as sort of the next 5 years or so of progress forward.
Great, thank you. I noticed that obviously we had talked about this being a report for statewide, but we did have a question on very specific. I'm not sure the information is contained in the report, but I want to ask it and see if there are other resources to point to. But specifically, we have a question on San Diego probation and how this new evidence-based practice is going. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about the information that you looked at from a individual county level versus a state level.
That's a great question. So as you said, our perspective in this report is really to at the state level, and to try and tell the story about how the state has navigated this reform period, and that means that we don't give any particular scrutiny to a given county, and so we're not in a great position to speak to the San Diego context. This report to me is perhaps more useful for particular local agencies to think about the broader context of California and to try and, in a sense, sort of measure their own performance in relation to what's been going on in the state. And perhaps Mia can, but I can't comment specifically on San Diego's performance in that regard.
I agree, Rick, and I can't comment specifically on San Diego, but just to point you to some resources, I know San Diego did do some reporting, some internal reporting on SB 678, and also the Judicial Council did track sort of what was going on across counties, and they have a report each year that might be good references for that. In our limited experience talking with San Diego County outside of the context of this report, I know that they've made a lot of steps forward. They have a system called Offender 360 where they're trying to integrate data across their systems so that they can really see individuals as they move across agencies. So that's just one thought about San Diego to add.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Very unhelpful. Can you talk a little bit about if you looked at other states, or how does this compare to other states, or how California probation is different or similar in that regard and on evidence-based practices?
That's a great question. You know, around the time the SB 678 passed, there were about 8 states, including California, that were trying somewhat. There was some overlap in what we were doing, and the overlap was generally something around incentive-based funding for probation. And California really stood out following SB 678 with the amount of success it had in the near term. And, you know, one of the similar states you can look to is Arizona. They passed something quite similar and also had some success under SB 678. But with SB 678 and then, you know, setting the stage for realignment and other reforms, California is really standing out nationally as at the forefront of innovations around reducing incarceration and improving community supervision and other preventative interventions.
That's helpful. I'll put Chief Keen on the spot because I know this is a question near and dear to his heart. He's talked about it on several occasions, so I'll give you a chance to weigh in here if you want to unmute your line. There you go.
You know, it certainly is, and I really appreciate the reference to Arizona. I do think they had tremendous success by doing something like this, but I think one of the things that California did certainly better than Arizona did, frankly, is that they actually funded it. If you recall, Arizona did a lot of this work, put a lot of incentive-based programs, but unfortunately were not able to fund it completely, which I think limited its success. And I think that when we think about California, the fact that the legislature and the governors over the years have been very supportive and continue to fund this program, I think has allowed for the wealth of data that we've been able to collect. And I think that that's probably one of the more distinguishing factors between California and other places. We have a track record of funding this program now, and so we are able to really see what the benefits are.
Thank you. Your report talks about prison bed savings based on revocations. Is there any lessons learned here in a local context, for example, with jails?
Yeah, I think conceptually the same model applies. You know, the idea is that we may be able to achieve better outcomes in a lower cost correctional setting. And while prisons are certainly the most costly correctional settings, jails are also quite costly and can in some counties become fairly crowded as well. And so thinking about not just for sort of the population that would have gone to prison under realignment, the population that would have been revoked to prison under SB 78, but thinking about a broader population. How can we apply these principles to reduce revocations and even in a more preventative way to reduce future criminal justice involvement when you have someone under probation supervision? I think that makes a lot of sense.
Great. Thank you. Well, that takes us to the end of our questions that have come in. I'll ask one last time for any of the participants who are interested in a question to use the Q&A function. But before we leave, any final parting thoughts from our panelists today? Now is a great time to do so.
I'll just say, thank you. This is we realize this is a sort of inaugural report, and we're pretty honored. I feel pretty honored to be asked to participate in this, and I also really appreciated the support and the process that we put in place to develop the research concept it's really, to me, sort of stands out in my career as kind of an interesting engagement between research and the practitioner world in a way that is hopefully mutually beneficial. So I just want to say thank you for that. We should mention that Kevin O'Connell deserves quite a bit of credit and should have been acknowledged in the beginning. He was anybody who knows him knows he is incredibly high caliber data and technician, and so we really want to demonstrate appreciation for him as well.
Great point. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you, Riken. And just that, I think I wanted to add that we're just thrilled to have this Resource Institute kicked off, and all the things that we're talking about can only be made better and stronger with something like a Resource Institute for the probation departments across the state. So we're really thrilled you're doing this, and we'd love to be supportive, and we're really grateful for the chance to participate.
Thank you. Chief King.
So definitely, Karen, what I will tell you is, first of all, certainly thank you to both me and Riken for all their hard work on this report. As a person who has long wished for research that demonstrated the effectiveness of the work we do, I'm not only excited, but I'm extremely encouraged for what this report for not only would have done for us up to this point, but quite frankly would do for us for the next 10 years. I think as we enter this very challenging time of uncertainty, and the scarcity of resources will come back around again. So to have information now that clearly demonstrates that certain practices work and are worthy of consideration of continued funding, I cannot think of a more important time to have this information in hand. So thank you very much to both of you. And certainly I'm really appreciative of CPOC and Capri for their vision for not only for what's happening now, but for the future. So thank you all very much.
Thank you all for being a part of today, as well as those who are watching. Appreciate you joining us. It is the first of what we hope will be many opportunities to merge the operations practitioners with the research. It's something very important to our association, and so look forward to this type of collaboration in the future, and appreciate again the participants today, and look forward to more of this kind of work in the future. So thank you again, and we will sign off at this point.
Thank you.